Welcome leaders and strategists to today's explainer. Now, we are taking a highly analytical, laser-focused look at the current macro-political climate. You can think of this as a purely neutral, straight-down-the-middle intelligence briefing. Because look, as we navigate this incredibly complex global environment, understanding the underlying currents of our political dynamics, well, it isn't just interesting anymore, right? It's absolutely essential for organizational planning, mitigating risk, and your overall strategic forecasting. So we're going to strip away all the noise, the daily rhetoric, the flashy headlines. Instead, we're looking strictly at the structural reality of the environment we're actually operating in right now. Okay, our entire briefing today is built around this one really foundational source quote: Trump versus Biden, the most bitter rivalry in modern history. Now, in the world of strategic forecasting, a single sentence like that, distilled from broader societal observation, can actually contain massive implications for us. So we're going to deconstruct this specific thesis piece by piece. We really need to understand exactly what this means for your operating environment and how we can use this concentrated insight to essentially forecast systemic friction. All right, let's dive right into this. First up, the subjects themselves. A binary dynamic. We're framing these two figures strictly as rival entities operating within a massive macro system. When the source explicitly says Trump versus Biden, it's establishing a really clear, completely unavoidable binary dynamic. So, in strategic terms, we aren't looking at these individuals through the lens of policy right now. Actually, scratch that. We're looking at them as two completely distinct poles of gravity. For a business leader or an organizational strategist, recognizing this binary is literal step one. It means your consumer markets are split, your supply chains are under immense scrutiny, and your regulatory futures are tied to two deeply opposing forces. When we compare Trump on one side and Biden on the other, we're really looking at this through the lens of systemic rivalry. Placing these two forces side by side like this visually establishes the exact binary conflict that our source is describing. Now, by framing them neutrally, we aren't endorsing either viewpoint here, and we certainly aren't validating one over the other. Instead, we're mapping the literal structure of the rivalry itself. As leaders, when you map this out in your own heads, you should basically see a giant field of tension. Literally every market segment, every single ESG mandate, and every major capital allocation decision currently sits somewhere on the spectrum between these two defining poles. Having established that binary, let's unpack the dynamic itself and zero in on bitterness. We have to shift our focus to this specific, highly emotionally charged word chosen by the source to describe our environment. Think about it. The source doesn't call it a competitive rivalry. It doesn't call it a historic rivalry, at least not right off the bat. It uses a very specific word: bitter. And in intelligence analysis, word choice is everything. Bitterness implies something fundamentally different than just mere disagreement. It implies an environment where the standard rules of engagement might just be completely suspended, where emotions are driving actions just as much as logic, and where the tension is just deeply entrenched. So, what does this all mean for us? The crucial point here is how we translate this emotional term into a tangible business risk factor that you actually have to anticipate. For our purposes, bitterness is basically a metric of friction. We're defining it here as a climate characterized by a lack of compromise, high friction, and strategic unpredictability. If you are running an organization right now, a lack of compromise means legislative gridlock, which totally affects how fast new regulations or economic stimuli can pass. High friction means ongoing social and market volatility. And strategic unpredictability? Well, that means your standard risk models for things like global tariffs, tax codes, or compliance might need significantly wider margins of error. Number one. I want to highlight this because out of all the possible variables to describe our current climate, our source distills the entire dynamic down to the single defining metric: the sheer intensity of the rivalry. It's not about economic philosophy, it's not about geographic base, it is the friction itself. When the absolute defining characteristic of a macro environment is the friction between the actors rather than the policies of the actors, it forces organizations to fundamentally change how they navigate the landscape. The rivalry itself literally becomes the primary environmental condition you have to deal with. Now, let's talk about the scope. Modern history. This friction we're talking about is massively compounded by the scope of the claim. The quote explicitly states that this is the most bitter rivalry in modern history. We're transitioning to this historical scale to underscore exactly why business leaders must pay incredibly close attention to this specific era. We are not just dealing with your standard run-of-the-mill election cycle friction here. The source is telling us point blank that the current environment operates completely outside the bounds of what we've seen in recent generations. And this brilliantly illustrates that scope. Looking at point 1, our historical baseline in past centuries, moving to point 2, the political eras of the 20th century, and arriving at point 3, modern history and this current unprecedented rivalry. The source basically elevates this dynamic way above all previous historical baselines in our modern context. So for a strategist, this means the trusty old playbooks your company used to navigate political shifts back in the 1990s or early 2000s, yeah, they might as well belong in a museum. The actual baseline of friction has structurally changed, and relying on outdated precedent is, frankly, a massive strategic vulnerability. All right, let's pivot from all this conceptual deconstruction into the executive synthesis. This is the reflective framework, because how do leaders actively navigate such an intense, historically unique climate? You can't just sit back and observe the friction, you have to actually plan for it. This synthesis is all about taking this baseline intelligence, a binary, deeply bitter, historically unprecedented rivalry, and hardwiring it straight into your organizational resilience strategy. We're talking about stress testing everything, from your supply chain all the way to your capital investments. To wrap up the core components of this briefing, here is exactly what you need to factor into your planning. First, the rivals. You've got to view them as absolute binary forces shaping the market and regulatory landscape. Second, the emotion. Plan for peak bitterness, which translates directly to high operational and social friction. And third, the era. Recognize that this is absolutely unprecedented in modern history, meaning your legacy playbooks need an immediate update. These are the 3 pillars from our source text, translated directly into a macro environmental briefing for you. Which leads us to our final and honestly most critical takeaway. If we accept the source's premise, that this is indeed the most bitter rivalry in modern history, the question is no longer about who wins or loses. The real question for you is, how resilient is your strategy against the friction? Are your supply chains, your internal communications, and your market projections genuinely built to withstand an era defined by a complete lack of compromise and strategic unpredictability? Because honestly, that is the real test of leadership in this climate. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Take this framework, apply it to your own models, and I will see you next time.